They thought I was just some invisible old man, a quiet fixture on the hill with a rusty gate and a patch of dirt that didn't an oppose. T fit their vision of a perfect suburban utopia, but they found out the hard way that silence ISN and oppose. T the same thing as submission. It started on a Tuesday that smelled like honeysuckle and diesel. A morning where I was just trying to enjoy my second cup of coffee on the porch of the house my grandfather built with his own 2 hands back when this county was nothing but cattle and creek beds. I looked down toward the lower pasture, the piece of land that sits just outside the manicured grip of the Blackwood Creek Homeowners Association, and there it was, a massive triple-axle flatbed rig with, in quote, BCA contractors, in quote, stenciled on the side, just casually nosing its way through my tall grass like it owned the place. The driver didn't and oppose. To even look toward my house, he just parked that beast right under my favorite old oak tree, the one where my daughter used to have a tire swing, and hopped out to light a cigarette while the engine kept rumbling, shaking the very ground I pay taxes on. My name is Elias Thorne, and for 20 years, I've been the, in quote, holdout, end quote, the guy who refused to sign his land over to the HOA when they bought up the surrounding orchards to build their cookie-cutter McMansions. And let me tell you, that didn't sit well with the board. I didn't in oppose to go down there screaming because that's not how I was raised, so I just pulled on my work boots and walked down through the dew, feeling the dampness soak into my jeans, and tapped on the driver in oppose. Window as politely as a man can when he's looking at a 5-ton intruder. I told him, in quote, morning, son, you might have missed a sign, but this is private property, end quote. And the kid barely looked up from his phone, just gave me this lazy, half-baked shrug and said, end quote, the board told us this was the staging area for the new PAR project, so take it up with them, old-timer, end quote. I felt that first little spark of heat behind my ribs, that quiet warning that things were about to get ugly. So I told him the board didn't in oppose to own a single blade of grass on this side of the fence line, but he just rolled his window up and went back to his TikToks. That was the first day, the day they left a 6-inch deep rut in the soft earth and a rainbow-colored oil slick right where the wildflowers bloom. And as I watched him rumble away, I knew this wasn't an oppose, an accident. It was a test. By Thursday, my pasture looked like a logistics hub for a small invasion, with dump trucks, stacks of PVC piping, and crates of stone pavers all dumped haphazardly across my land. And every time I called the HOA office, I got the same syrupy, condescending tone from a woman named Victoria Vance. Victoria was the kind of person who wore a power suit to a neighborhood barbecue and looked at my 1950s farmhouse like it was a stain on a white carpet. And when I finally got her on the line, she didn't in oppose. To even apologize, she just said, in quote, oh, well, Elias, don't in oppose. TB's so provincial, we're improving the community value for everyone. And since your lot is basically an unused extension of our common area, it's only logical we use it for a few weeks, end quote. I told her logic didn't in oppose. T override the deed in my safe, and that in quote, and use in quote, mit in quote, preserve in quote, but she just laughed that hollow, socialite laugh and told me to, in quote, be a team player in quote, before hanging up. The following week, the sky opened up and gave us one of those Texas-sized deluges, the kind that turns the black clay into a soup that'll swallow a boot hole. And that's when they really did it. They drove 3 massive cement mixers onto the field in the middle of the downpour. They got stuck, of course, spinning those huge tires until they'd excavated 4-foot craters into the heart of my meadow. And when they finally hauled them out with a tow winch, they left the place looking like a battlefield in Flanders. I stood there in the rain, my coffee long gone cold, looking at the decimated remains of the grass my father had taught me to mow, and something inside me just clicked. It wasn't an oppose about the land anymore. It was about the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of people who think that because they have a title and a gavel, they can erase a man's boundaries. I spent the next 3 days in my workshop, the smell of ozone and hot sparks filling the air as I worked the welder, my hands remembering the rhythm from my days in the shipyard. And I built something substantial. I didn't in oppose. Just build a gate. I built a statement out of heavy-duty steel I-beams and reinforced hinges that could hold back a tank. And while I worked, I kept my trail cameras humming, capturing every license plate, every face, and every bucket of debris they dumped on my soil. I saw Victoria herself walking across my field in her expensive heels, pointing at my trees, and talking to a contractor like she was planning where to put the next gazebo, completely oblivious to the fact that I was documenting every single second of her criminal trespass. The final straw came when I found a, notice of violation, tucked into my mailbox on my own property, telling me that mine, unmowed meadow, was an eyesore and that if I didn't into oppos, remediate the aesthetic nuisance, the HOA would fine me $50 a day. They were fining me for the damage they had caused, for the grass they had crushed. And that was the moment I stopped being the quiet old man on the hill and started being the man who remembers how to win a war of attrition. I sent one last email, a certified, ironclad warning that any vehicle found on my land after 6 a.m. on Monday would be considered abandoned and secured until restitution was made, and I knew they wooed in oppos. Read it. Or if they did, they'd just laugh and call me a senile crank. Monday morning, 5:45 a.m., the fog was thick enough to hide the world, and I heard the low, guttural roar of the fleet arriving for flatbeds and 2 utility vans, all rolling into the staging area, with their headlights cutting through the mist. I waited until they had all parked, until the drivers had walked off to the main construction site a quarter-mile away, and then I backed my truck down the trail, swung my new steel beast into place, and I did it in oppos. Just lock it. I welded the hinge pins, and the slide bowl shut right there in the dark. The blue arc of the welder was the only light in the valley, a fierce, blinding sizzle that fused that gate to the earth, and then I went back to my porch, sat in my rocker, and waited for the sun to come up. Around 8 a.m., the screaming started, a frantic, high-pitched chorus of contractors realizing their $60,000 rigs were trapped behind 2 inches of hardened steel, and before long, Victoria Vance's white SUV came screaming up the gravel road, kicking up a cloud of dust that smelled like panic. She marched up to that gate, her face turning a shade of purple that almost matched her silk blouse, and she started rattling the bars like a caged animal, screaming for me to, open this illegal obstruction right this instant. I just took a slow sip of my tea, leaned back so the chair creaked, and called down, Morning, Victoria. Looks like you've got some equipment trespassing on my property. I'll be happy to discuss the release terms once the environmental inspectors arrive. And, she threatened me with the police. She threatened me with a lawsuit that would, strip the skin off my back, And she even tried to claim I was kidnapping her workers, even though those boys had all walked out the side pedestrian gap 2 hours ago. When a sheriff finally arrived, an old friend named Miller who I'd played cards with for a decade, he didn't oppose to even draw his belt. He just looked at the gate, looked at the ruts of my field, and then looked at the folder of certified plat maps and timestamp photos I handed him. He turned to Victoria and said, Ma and oppos. Mr. Thorne told you to stay off his land. You didn't in oppos. Listen, and now you've got a civil dispute on your hands. But as far as the law is concerned, he's just securing his fence line. You want your trucks back? You better start talking about how you're going to fix this man in oppos. As grass. The standoff lasted 4 days, and those contractors were losing thousands of dollars an hour in idle time, while I just sat on my porch and enjoyed the most peaceful week I'd had in years, watching the hawks circle overhead, while Victoria's lawyers tried to find a loophole that didn't in oppos exist. I eventually let them out, but only after a notary-signed agreement was delivered to my door, including a $35,000 check for, land restoration and psychological distress, and a formal, written apology read aloud at the next board meeting. The best part wasn't oppos, the money, though. It was the look on Victoria's face when she had to stand in front of the whole neighborhood and admit that the and used common area, was actually a private sanctuary they had no right to touch. Since then, the HOA has been real quiet. The trucks dawn into oppos. To even slow down when they pass my gate, and the wildflowers are starting to grow back over the ruts, thicker and brighter than they ever were before. But it makes me wonder, did they really learn their lesson, or are they just waiting for me to get a little older, a little slower, before they try to move the line again? What do you guys think? Was I too harsh? Or is a man's land the only thing he really is left to defend in a world that tries to pave over everything? Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to draw a line in the dirt against people who thought they were above the law, because I'd love to hear I'm not the only one who still believes a, in quote, no trespassing, in quote, sign actually means something.